stories really relaxing and soothing, and of course magical. So I hope you guys enjoy. So on the back it says, down the ages, children have listened spellbound to tales of fairy folk in faraway places. They will gain special delight from hearing the stories in Shirley Barber's well-loved fairy collection. As they turn the pages of the book and look at her exquisite paintings, enchanting music between each story adds to the magic. I'm pretty sure I bought this off of Amazon like a year or so ago, and yeah, the CD is like cracked. I don't know if you can see that. Hopefully I didn't just blind you. Let's get started. So pretty. So this is called the Royal Jewelers. Under the hedge, by a big green field, stood a tiny shop called Edwin Beadle and Son Jewelers. If you knelt down and peered through the window, you could see Mr. Beadle and his son Benny working in the shop while Miss Beadle cooked the meals and looked after weeny baby Beadle, asleep in his nutshell cradle. The Beadles lived very comfortably until one day a huge red tractor started to plow up the green field beside their shop. The Beadles, terrified, packed up the few things they could carry and fled till they reached the forest of Fairyland. If we aren't safe living in Fairyland, said Miss Beadle firmly, well, I don't know where we can go. Indeed, I don't. So among the twisted roots of a large tree, they set up their tiny new shop with their home behind it. There's the little beetle family. I don't know if you can see. There we go. At first, very few customers stopped to look at the necklaces and rings. Mr. Beadle would sadly shake his head, remembering the nice shop and home he had once had. Nothing would ever be the same again, he thought. Then, one day, a beautiful golden fairy stopped and looked at the tiny shop in surprise. She knelt down so she could see better, and Mr. Beadle and Benny proudly showed her their finest jewelry. These are wonderfully made, said the golden fairy. Your work is so fine. May I take 3 necklaces to show the fairy queen? Mr. Beadle made haste to wrap the necklaces in flower petals, tying them into neat parcels with grass blades, and gave them to the fairy. The next day, the golden fairy reappeared. Mr. Beadle, the queen loves your necklaces. She wants to buy all 3, she said, smiling. She offers you 3 wishes in payment, and she would also like to order a very special tiara with a matching necklace and bracelet to be made in gold and many colored precious gems. Mr. Beadle was at first delighted, but then he became anxious. Where could he get all the gold and different colored jewels he would need for such an order? Dearie me, chuckled Miss Beadle. You've got 3 wishes, haven't you? Wish first for a gold and jewel mine deep beneath this tree. Second, for a lovely new shop that's big enough to live in, too. And third, for a food cupboard that fills up again after you've taken things out. So that is what he did. Now a quaint little shop stands among the twisted tree roots. Inside, Mr. Beetle is always busy at his workbench, while Mrs. Beetle looks after baby Beetle and cooks such delicious treats that there is nearly always a visitor dropping in for a chat and a slice of freshly baked cake. And every time Mr. Beetle needs another diamond, or an emerald, or a gold nugget, Benny nips down the tunnel to the mine below. Whenever anyone is sad about their life, Miss Beetle simply smiles and says, "Never give up hope." Look at us, we lost everything. Then overnight, things changed, and here we are, better off than we ever were before. Such heartwarming little stories. The next one is called The Unicorns, The Unicorns, The Unicorns. The artwork is so pretty. Oh my gosh, still very magical. I don't know if it's focusing. I'm sorry if it's not. So this one is called The Unicorns. Among the golden hills of fairyland, the unicorns run wild and free among the buttercups, with the sunlight flashing from their golden hooves and horns. One midsummer day, the sun was shining and a warm breeze was blowing, but there was a restless, unsettled air about the unicorns. "Mother," said a young foal, whose name was Ivory, "everything seems strange today. Is something unusual about to happen?" "Yes, dear," replied Moonbeam, his mother. "Every midsummer day, the fairy people use a golden flute to call the unicorns to them, and the fairy children choose one unicorn to live with them for a year." "Does the unicorn ever come back again?" asked Ivory. "Oh yes," his mother replied. "When the fairies choose a new unicorn, they return the one who was chosen the year before. Each unicorn spends a year at the fairy palace, learning how to be gentle and obedient for the fairy children." "If they choose me," said Ivory, "I shall say, 'No, I don't want to go. I want to stay with you, Mother, always.'" Moonbeam lifted her head and lovingly nuzzled her young foal. "Dear one, if you are called by the golden flute, you can't help but go. It plays a magical note that unicorns can't resist." Ivory tossed his head and went for a canter, his white mane and tail streaming in the fresh breeze. He was half a hillside away when a distant sweet fluting brought him to a surprised halt. He found he could not help but turn towards it, and soon, quite against his will, he was cantering back to all the other unicorns on the hillside. There he saw the fairy folk and the flute player for the first time. They were laughing and singing as they made their way along the lane, which led up from the lower regions of fairyland. The fairy children saw Ivory and called joyfully, "That one! Oh, let's choose that one." "Not me, Mother," he pleaded. "Don't let them take me. I don't want to go. It isn't fair." Moonbeam gave him a velvet kiss. "Little son, it is an honor to be chosen by the fairies, and you must go. We'll soon be together again." Then the fairies placed a garland of flowers around Ivory's neck, and he went with them to fairyland. A year passed, and once again it was Midsummer Day. Moonbeam stood patiently with the rest of the unicorns as the fairies chose a new unicorn to take to fairyland. Ivory was released by the fairy children and trotted briskly up to her. They nuzzled lovingly. Moonbeam said, You've grown, little son. And was it so bad after all?" Ivory looked embarrassed. "I missed you, Mother, but I had a really good time, and they told me I was the nicest pet unicorn they ever had." Then he kicked up his golden heels and galloped away, scattering butterflies and flower petals and enjoying his freedom once again. There's them reunited. This is very nostalgic for me. The next one is called Wilfred's New Friend. Art is so pretty. There were two mouse families in Filbert Wood, the Morleys and the Montgomerys. The young mice of both families went to Hollow Log School, but the Montgomery mice were rich, and they had scarves and umbrellas for days when it was cold and rainy. The Morley mice, however, had no scarves at all, and only one umbrella between them. So if it began to rain when Wilfred Morley's mouse was on his way home from school, he had to wait until it stopped, or until his mother came with the umbrella. One day it began to rain, so Wilfred ran to a hollow at the foot of the nearby tree and sat down to wait. Presently, Millie Montgomery Mouse and her brother Milford came past under their umbrellas. "Who got his whiskers wet because he hasn't got an umbrella?" cheered Millie. "Wet whiskers will dry soon enough," said Wilfred. "Who only has an old bag to put his homework in instead of a proper school bag?" sneered Milford. "I may not have a smart school bag," replied Wilfred, "but at least I do my own homework." The sass. The sass. Everyone knew Mr. Montgomery Mouse did Milford's sums for him, so the brother and sister decided to hurry home before Wilfred could embarrass them further. Wilfred was making himself comfortable on some fallen leaves and practicing his tables up to 8 times 11, when suddenly a beautiful fairy dressed in shades of gold ran through the raindrops and arrived at the tree. "May I shelter here with you until this rain stops?" she asked. The fairy settled herself and put down a small basket of raspberries she had gathered. "I'm going to make some jam when I get home," she explained, "but we could eat 1 raspberry each now to help pass the time." Wilfred was rather shy at first, never having actually spoken to a fairy before, but by the time they had eaten a raspberry each and joked about the pips, they were feeling like old friends. Then they played I Spy with My Little Eye, and later Wilfred showed the fairy how to play noughts and crosses using the back page of his school book. As they played, the rain slowed, and soon Miss Morley Mouse appeared before them, under her big patched umbrella. "There now, Wilfie," she chuckled. "Perhaps I needn't have come to meet you after all. The rain has almost stopped." Wilfred introduced his new friend to his mother, and they talked for a little while until the sun was shining brightly again. Then the fairy said a smiling goodbye to the mice and promised to call by in a few days with a pot of her raspberry jam. "Well, you are a lucky mouse," said Wilfred's mother. "There's not many who get the chance to make friends with a real fairy." "Yes," agreed Wilfred happily. "Do you know what, Mum? If we were rich and I had an umbrella of my own, I would never have met her at all." So cute. Oh my goodness. I think that's Wilfred right there, dance. So cute. Such wholesome stories. The story is called The Fairy Queen's Ruby Pendant. Alyssa was the Queen Elvira's youngest sister. She was a beautiful, impulsive, kind-hearted fairy, much loved by the pixies and all the fairy children. The queen would often say, "Alyssa, you must quiet down. You are a fairy princess, so behave with dignity." Alyssa would try to be good for a while, but before she knew it, she would be running up the palace staircase again while the fairy children chased after her with squeals of laughter. Because of her high spirits, Alyssa was often in trouble, and one day something really dreadful happened. The queen was standing before her mirror admiring her ruby pendant. The ruby was a rare gem with a star glowing in its heart, given to her by the king to wear to the fairy ball. Suddenly, Alyssa burst into the room. She bumped into the queen and knocked the pendant to the floor, where it broke into 2 pieces. "Alyssa," cried the queen, "how could you be so clumsy? The ruby is ruined." The queen was very upset. Alyssa crept around like a mouse and wept. She knew she would not be allowed to go to the ball. The day of the ball dawned, and the fairy children came running to find her, their favorite playmate. "Come to the seashore with us, Alyssa," they cried. "The tide is very low today, and we can see jewels in the rock pools just waiting for us to pick them up." Alyssa still felt sad, but she was too kind-hearted to refuse the children. So together they set off for the seashore. In spite of her sadness, she joined in the search, and before long she spotted a magnificent gem. "Oh, look," she cried. It was the ruby with a double star in its heart, the rarest of all gems to be found in fairyland. Alyssa hurried back to the palace and asked to see the king. "Your Majesty," said Alyssa respectfully, "I have found this beautiful gem and hope you will take it to give to my sister in place of the pendant I broke." The king gasped at its beauty of the stone. "This is the finest jewel I've ever seen," he said. "This certainly makes amends for your clumsiness." Soon a new glittering, double-starred pendant was presented to the queen. The king explained where the beautiful jewel came from. "Oh, Alyssa," cried the queen, "it is the most beautiful ruby. All is forgiven and forgotten, and of course you must come to the ball tonight." "Hooray!" shouted Alyssa. She rushed out of the room, pursued by the fairy children, and the sound of her feet flying up the palace stairway could plainly be heard. The king and queen looked at each other and smiled. Alyssa hadn't changed, but perhaps they didn't really want her to. There's a little picture of her playing with the children. The next one is called Elfrin and the Baby Bluebird. Artwork is very pretty. It says, "It was the day before Fairyland Flower Festival. The fairy folk were in the fields and woodlands picking flowers to make wreaths and garlands. Netta took her baby brother Elfrin with her to the blossom woods. Elfrin could walk and talk quite well, but he was not very good at flying just yet, and he still needed an afternoon's sleep. Netta and Elfrin joined the other fairy folk for a picnic lunch under the trees. Later, she found a hollow under a shady fern, made a nice nest of soft moss, and tucked her baby brother in it. "Now go to sleep, little one," she told him, "and I'll come back to fetch you at tea time." As soon as Netta had gone, Elfrin opened his eyes, climbed out of his bed, and toddled off. He had not gone very far when he heard some tweeting in a large bush. He looked up and saw a baby bluebird flapping wildly on the edge of the nest. Suddenly, it fell and landed on the soft moss in front of Elfrin. "You naughty birdie," scolded Elfrin. "You should be sleeping in bed." He picked up the baby bird, puffing and panting, and lugged it back to his own nest under the fern. "Now go to sleep, little one," he said firmly, just like Netta, and off he toddled again. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Bluebird fluttered back to their nests and found the baby had gone. They flew into a panic, tweeting loudly, terrified that harm had come to their baby. They flew through the trees until they came to the nearest of the fairies, which happened to be Netta. "Calm down," she told them. "Your baby can't be very far. I'll help you look for it." Meanwhile, Elfrin had arrived back at the bluebird's nest. He wondered if there were any more baby birds in it, so he climbed all the way up and out along a branch until he reached the nest. It was empty, but it was so cozy that Elfrin thought he would try it out. He climbed in and quickly fell asleep. In the other nest, near the fern, the baby bluebird sat up and began loudly tweeting for its parents. Netta and the bluebirds followed its tweets to the fern-shaded nest that Netta had made for her brother earlier. "Well, here is your baby, but where is my baby brother?" cried Netta, now rather worried herself. "I wonder if—" she murmured. Then she flew off to the bush where the bluebirds had their nest. There she found her baby brother fast asleep. "What have you been up to, Elfrin?" laughed Netta. Elfrin opened his big blue eyes and yawned. "Tea time?" he asked his sister. "Yes, tea time," smiled Netta. "And the bluebirds want their nest back, so unless you want earthworms for tea like a baby bluebird, you had better come home with me." There's Netta and her baby brother, Elfrin. Called Lost in the Forest. "Now, children," said Miss Rabbit one sunny afternoon, "I want you to go to Granny's burrow and give her a bottle of my violet cough syrup. When you arrive at the crossroads, take the path marked Primrose Lane, and that will lead you to Granny's home. But if you see those two rattling brothers, don't stop to play with them, because you know they're always getting into mischief." I guess we know what's going to happen. Off went Bobtail and Fluffkin, but when they reached a crossroads, who should they see but the two naughty young rats leaning against the signpost. Bobtail hurried his sister Fluffkin along the path marked Primrose Lane and away from the rattlings, who cheered and whistled rudely after them. They soon reached Granny's burrow, and she welcomed them with kisses and afternoon tea. Granny was glad to have cough syrup because she had a tickling cough on cold nights. When it was time for them to return home, Granny told them how to find their way. "Now when you reach the crossroads, take the path marked Cowslip Warren," she said, "and then you will soon be safely home." When Bobtail and Fluffkin arrived at the crossroads, they were glad to see the two rats had gone. "This sign says Cowslip Warren," Bobtail told his sister, "and so that is our way home." But soon they became worried. The path they were following seemed to be leading them deeper into the forest. Instead of home, Bobtail stopped. "Fluffkin, this must be the wrong path," he said. "I think we're lost. We must find a hole to spend the night, and tomorrow, when it's light, we'll try to find our way home." But Bobtail couldn't find a hole deep enough to hide in, and he could hear a fox barking in the distance. Fluffkin was so frightened that she trembled. Suddenly, a beautiful blue fairy appeared before them, holding a sparkling wand in her hand. "Don't be afraid," she said. "I will use my magic to send the fox away on a long hunt, and I will teach those naughty rattling brothers a lesson. They turned the signpost round so you would take the wrong path. That's why you became lost. And as for you, little bunnies, I will light my bluebell lamps and show you the way home. Oh, thank you, kind fairy, chorused the little rabbits. Off they ran along the path towards home. The fairies' bluebell lamps lit up just ahead of them all the way until they ran into the arms of their mother and father, who were waiting for them at their own front door. After such an adventure in the dark forest, they were safely home once more. Ooh. Sorry about that. There's the little bunnies running home. So cute. The next section is called The Enchanted Woods. Once upon a time, a little girl called Sarah Jane, lived in a pretty cottage at the edge of the wood. The trees in the wood grew close together, and on hot days she liked to sit in the shade and play with her toys. There were ferns and flowers growing thickly between the trees, and patches of wild strawberry plants. One warm, sunny day, Sarah Jane wandered into the woods to play with her toys and look for wild strawberries. Leaving her toys beneath a tree, she wandered further into the forest and found a few strawberries to put in her basket. All the while, she had the strangest feeling she was being watched. Eventually, she came to a big old tree, and under the tree was a ring of mushrooms. It was a magic fairy ring. But Sarah Jane didn't see it until after she had stepped inside. She stared at it, puzzled, and wondered what it was. There she is. The fairy ring. Suddenly, Sarah Jane glimpsed a procession of fairies winding through the trees. Some were quaint and impish, and others were the most beautiful creatures she had ever seen. "Sarah Jane," they cried, "you are needed in fairyland. Now that we've caught you in our magic fairy ring, we can take you with us." Then they waved their magic wands, and Sarah Jane felt herself become smaller and smaller. She was now no taller than the fairies, and she felt as light as thistledown. The fairies took her gently by the hands, and together they flew up above the treetops and out over the shimmering sea. It's very pretty. They landed on the shores of a strange and beautiful land. The flowers were taller than they were, and huge butterflies waited to greet them. Soon a messenger arrived from the fairy palace. "Sarah Jane," he announced, "the fairy king and queen have been told of your arrival, and they would like to see you now." So the fairies sat Sarah Jane on the back of a butterfly, and together they flew over a lake to the fairy palace, whose golden turrets sparkled in the morning sunlight. The king and queen welcomed Sarah Jane and told her why she was needed in fairyland. "Our daughter is to be married to a prince from a neighboring kingdom," said the queen. "We need the presence of a mortal to ensure their good fortune and a happy marriage." "Yes," said the king, "you will bring them good luck. Come, you will be our honored guest and join us in our celebration." Soon it was time for the wedding. The chatter and laughter of the guests grew quiet as they gathered to watch the prince and princess exchange wedding vows. So pretty. After the wedding, a magnificent banquet was held in a glittering hall overlooking the lake. Sweet music was played by a band of funny little musicians while everyone, including Sarah Jane, feasted on the finest delicacies fairyland could offer. I think I like this page even better. The green color is so nice. I don't know if the camera is picking it up, but it's really pretty. When the banquet was over, it was time for the prince and princess to leave. Together they descended the golden stairway as their guests cheered and showered them with rose petals. Then they climbed into a golden carriage drawn by dragonflies and flew off to their new home over the hills. Now it was time for Sarah Jane to return home too. The fairies flew with her over the sea and back to the fairy ring in the woods. They waved their magic wands, and once again she became her normal size. "Goodbye, Sarah Jane," they said, dropping their feather-like kisses upon her cheek. "You will always be our special friend." Then she found herself alone in the woods once more, with her basket and her toys, beneath a shady tree. Sarah Jane looked at her basket in amazement. It was overflowing with small, delicious strawberries. She picked up the basket and her toys and wandered home. Her family found it hard to believe her wonderful tale of how she had been a guest at a fairy wedding, but certainly no one had ever seen so many wild strawberries as she had in her basket. They agreed that it must be a gift to her from the fairies, a sign to show she really had been to fairyland. The next section is called Rainbow Magic, Rainbow Magic, Rainbow Magic. Once upon a time, there was an old lady called Grand Tippet. She lived in a farmhouse on the edge of the forest with her granddaughter Annie and little dog Bozo. Around the house was a pretty rose garden, and around the garden was a grassy meadow that went right to the edge of the dark fern forest. Early in the morning, the deer and their fawns would come out of the forest and eat the grass in the meadow. Sometimes Annie could get quite close to a fawn, but little dog Bozo would run out and bark at the big deer. "One day they won't run away," Annie scolded. "Then you'll be sorry." But little dog Bozo only laughed. When the weather turned cold, Grand Tippet's knee joints stiffened, and her elbows creaked, and everything that could ache began to ache. Relatable. She would sigh and sadly say to Annie and little dog Bozo, "I'm getting old, and I'm good and ready for my heavenly reward, but who will look after you when I'm gone?" But Annie and little dog Bozo were not really worried because they felt sure Gran would go on being Gran forever. They built houses of dried fern fronds and made leaf boats and sailed them on the still water. A big fish lived in the pool, and if they kept very still, he rose to look at them. But Bozo always barked, and with a splash, the fish would be gone again. On showery days, Annie sometimes saw rainbows so close that she called Gran. "Shall I run to see if I can find the fairy's pot of gold at the end of the rainbow?" But Gran said, "You keep away from rainbows, Annie. They are very funny things. You can get caught under rainbows and never come home again." That's kind of dark. One day, when Annie and little dog Bozo were playing in the forest, it began to rain. They crept into a hollow tree. Soon the sun shone again, and suddenly a big, beautiful rainbow came curving out of the sky and touched the mossy ground right in front of them. Just inside the rainbow was a pot filled with gold. "Oh," cried Annie, "what a lovely present to take to Gran." She forgot all about Gran's warning and ran towards the pot, but as she and little dog Bozo went under the rainbow, something very strange happened. They started to shrink and became smaller and smaller until they turned into 2 little fairy folk. They each now had wings and were so small that the grass blades were as tall to them as trees. "Oh, Bozo," cried Annie, "how will we find our way home to Gran to tell her what's happened to us?" She sat down under a toadstool and began to cry. Bozo tried out his wings but landed head over paws in a clump of violets. Annie couldn't help but laughing. "We'll have to walk until we can learn to fly," she said. "Come on, let's go home." After a while, they came to a deep river. "How shall we get across?" whispered Annie to Bozo. And then a frog came out from under the moss-covered house and offered to ferry them across the water. "What a nice boat," Annie said as she climbed in. "It reminds me of something. Why, I do believe it's one of the boats we made when we were playing here." When they reached the other bank, Annie thanked the frog and gave him a biscuit from her lunch bag. There's them on the frog ferry. Sorry if that was loud. The sun went down and the forest filled with shadows. Annie and little dog Bozo began to feel frightened. Suddenly, a family of mice came scurrying along the path, scaring Bozo. But the mice were friendly and warned the 2 fairy folk that the big wild cat was out hunting. "Hurry, he's coming," they said. "Follow us." So Annie and little dog Bozo went home with the mice for supper. They had grasshopper pie and toasted midges, and Annie broke up some biscuits to give to the baby mice. Then they all went to sleep, tucked up, small and warm, in a soft bed of thistledown. When the moon rose, the mice ran out to dance in the moonlight. But Annie and little dog Bozo did not wake until sunrise. The next morning, Annie and Bozo said goodbye to the mice and set off on their long walk home. After a while, they rested with some friendly bluebirds they met on their way. They ate moth cakes and ant cookies and drank tea out of flower cups. Then they all sat on a wild rose branch and sang some songs until it was time for them to set off once more on their journey home. "Stop that at once," a voice commanded. "Put down that fairy person." It was the Fairy King. The cat sulkily put down the little dog Bozo and slunk away. Oops. I skipped a page, oops. The next day, they met a wise old Mr. Longlegs who knew almost everything about everything. After they had told him their story, he looked at them thoughtfully for a while and said, "I think you had better meet the Fairy King and Queen and all the other fairy folk. Little folk just like yourselves live in the ferny glade by the waterfall just down the path." Annie and little dog Bozo felt so happy to know that there were other little people just like themselves. They thanked Mr. Longlegs and ran towards the waterfall, which sparkled between the trees. But suddenly, that wicked wild cat pounced on little dog Bozo and was about to eat him when... "Stop that at once," a voice commanded. "Put down the fairy person." It was the Fairy King. The cat sulkily put down little dog Bozo and slunk away. Then the Fairy King led them to the fairy court where they met the Fairy Queen. In the ferny glade, they were gathered, all those who had gone under the rainbows at one time or another. The king explained that because Annie and Bozo had not listened to Grand Tibbet's warning, they would now be fairy folk forever and ever. They must learn to be good fairy folk, just like the others. Then all the fairies, elves, and pixies came forward to greet them. So Annie and little dog Bozo lived happily with the fairies, but they longed to see Gran again. One day they asked the king and queen if they could go visit her soon. All the court were winging their way through the fern forest till they came to Grand Tibbet's old house. Gran was sitting in the twilight, feeling very sad. She had given up all hope of ever seeing Annie and little dog Bozo again. Suddenly they looked up and saw a tiny little Annie and weeny little dog Bozo alight upon the veranda rail. Behind them, all the fairies fluttered down to picnic in her rose garden. There's a lot of reflection, I'm sorry. Hopefully you can still see some of it. There's Gran. "Look, Gran," cried Annie. "We're safe after all, but we have to be fairy folk forever and ever. We're well and happy, and we've brought a present for you, the pot of gold we found under the rainbow." So Annie and little dog Bozo lived with the fairy folk forever, but they often came to talk to Gran while the fairy court picnicked in her rose garden. Gran stopped worrying about who would take care of Annie and little dog Bozo, because she knew now that they could look after themselves. And what about the pot of gold? Of course it was only a fairy-sized pot of gold, so Gran set it in her mantelpiece in a tiny glass case, just to prove that fairy folk really did live in the fern forest, and that there really was a pot of gold to be found under the rainbow. I was gonna read two more, or I was gonna read from these two books. This one is The Complete Book of the Flower Fairies by Cicely Mary Parker. And I was gonna read from another one of Shirley Barber's book. This is the Magical Fairy Collection. I don't think it's the same. I don't think it's the same as this one. I think they're different. Let me double check. Yeah, it's different. It has different stories. But if you guys want another video like this where I read from these two books, I can definitely do that. Let me know if you guys enjoyed this type of video, and I can certainly make more. I hope you guys are enjoying my content so far. I'm having a lot of fun making it. It brings me a lot of joy. I also recently noticed a couple days ago we reached 200 subscribers, so I wanted to say thank you guys for being here. And yeah, I hope you guys found some relaxation in this video, and I'll see you guys soon.